Welcome. A couple of weeks ago, we saw how the United Church of Canada in post-World War II period gradually lost its position as the established Protestant church. Now, I'm using the term established church somewhat tongue-in-cheek here, because you see, in law, an established church is one denomination that is the official church in a country. The established church often has close ties with the government and the social establishment. Established churches in law exist in several European countries. They often receive financial support that is gathered with the other taxes that are collected. In Canada, we have never had an established church in that legal sense. While we were a British colony, the established status of the Church of England had some spillover effects to parts of the colonies that later became Canada. The same could be said of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec. However, these were not established churches in the legal sense, but they very much were in a practical sense. They were the churches that represented the most powerful individuals or families. Their members were often in government regardless of what party was actually in power. Being a member of those churches sometimes brought connections that could be useful in business or socially. For example, and in some places, not belonging to that church might create differences that were very real, but those would be impossible to prove in a court of law. For instance, two businessmen who were used to seeing one another at church might be more inclined to enter into a partnership than if one of them came from a fringe group. Young people might meet future eligible mates through church circles more easily than elsewhere. And so, when the United Church of Canada was formed in 1925, and for some 50 years afterwards, it could claim, by virtue of sheer membership size and influence, that it was Canada's established Protestant church. Now, with the decline in influence of all forms of formal religious institutions, that position waned. And as we saw, 1965 is the high water mark in terms of United Church of Canada membership. I don't know whether anyone has published a study of this, but we do know that 1965 was a high water mark in membership for several organizations and service clubs as well. So something was happening in Canadian society. The exact nature of that shift was hidden by the residual vitality of traditional groups and institutions. And this is also an example of what we have said throughout this term, that history occurs in a context. And while we might, at any given moment, concentrate on an aspect or an individual or an institution, we cannot ignore the context. In this case, the period since 1970 has been characterized by an almost continuous series of changes, some initiated within the church, many in response to changes in local and global contexts, but the church has needed to respond. For instance, in the same time frame that Canadian society was quickly changing, we also see a rapid growth in nationalist independence movements in former colonies in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Now, Canada was not a colonizing nation in the traditional sense of the word. However, the United Church and its predecessor denominations had lengthy histories of mission work in some of those former colonies. As we have seen, particularly in times of conflict, those missions played crucial humanitarian roles. That long and rich history of missionary work had deep emotional resonance with the folk in the pews. Both the Women's Missionary Society and the relevant General Council divisions worked hard at telling those stories and making those connections. In this period, after 1970, we see a growing unease with the traditional view of the missionary role coming into full flower. The concept that we in the global North and West were bringing something that they needed, namely a knowledge of Christ and the gospel that they lacked, felt increasingly outmoded, and it smacked of an ongoing spiritual colonialism. Indeed, by the 1970s, the United Church had largely ceased to send missionaries in the stereotypical sense. We can say that the new language of partnership was merely catching up to reality. To some folks in the pews, however, the shift from missionary to partner was heard as one more way in which the United Church was surrendering to modern notions and betraying a gospel commandment with incredibly deep roots. The United Church's involvement in ecumenical and global institutions also prompted suspicion in some quarters. The United Church of Canada has been a strong supporter of the World Council of Churches from its very beginning. And given the social and political contexts of many other member churches, we then began to hear much more of the language of seeking and promoting justice, particularly in terms of throwing off colonial rule. And though you and I might hear faint echoes of the social gospel in such language, when it was connected to what the public were told were politically suspect groups, such support raised real concern. One such group was the African National Congress in South Africa. Now remember the times. One of the great social and political fears was the seemingly unstoppable march of communism across the world. And so it was easy for some aspects of the media to portray the South African regime as a democratic bulwark against the global spread of communism in sub-Saharan Africa. So, any group that opposed the regime was automatically suspect and almost automatically labeled as an enemy. And so, when the World Council of Churches launched its program to combat racism, which the United Church as a member supported, it was then easy for publications such as the Reader's Digest to pillory the church for supporting terrorists. And it was difficult for the church to respond because the truth of apartheid and racial interaction was much more complex. It was much more than an issue of democracy versus communism. So we need to recognize that, and we also need to recognize the pattern wherein church members receive information and opinions from other sources and employ those as evidence with which to judge the church, because that continues today. People hear things in other media, they may find them on social media, and they use those to judge the church without really understanding the church's position, which might be, and often is, far more nuanced than what's summed up in a Facebook meme. And this was especially true in the early years of the program to combat racism, which was before the awareness of the full extent and impact of apartheid provided some counterbalance to the image of white South Africa as a bastion against communism, which at the time seemed to be triumphant everywhere. In some ways, it was reminiscent of the issues around the Second World War and not realizing the depth of the depravity of the Nazi regime until the extent of the death and concentration camps became more apparent. While the struggle around the program to combat racism was going on, it provided great ammunition to those who claimed that the church should stick to religion, meaning the salvation of souls and individual morality, and stay out of politics. And if you recall our discussion of the new curriculum, one of the challenges to the new curriculum in some people's minds was the fact that it was taking on a far less individualistic, individual salvation vision of Christianity and a much more communal and shared view of the impact of the gospel in the world. At the same time, an increasingly mobile society presented people with many more options, and a growing social pluralism paved the way for sports, movies, and shopping on Sunday. The growth of the suburbs based in the car and the ability for people to drive different places opened up all sorts of possibilities for this open day of the week. During this period, we also see the emergence of sports and movies, and later on shopping on the Sunday, which had traditionally been reserved primarily for church related activities. You may recall that in a previous session we talked about how in the post Second World War period the church met many social and sports needs because there were no other groups. Well, in this period that we're looking at this week, those groups began to emerge, and so community sports and social activities began to fill needs that had previously been met by the church, and particularly the church youth group. There was also a growing suspicion about the relevance of the church in the modern world. And this led many young people who previously would have entered ministry to pursue other careers, resulting in a drastic slump in seminary enrollments. It's a sociological fact that the respect in which a role or career or profession is held in society will often impact those, particularly young people, who choose to enter into it. In the period following the Second World War, it seemed obvious to everybody that one way, amongst many, but one way of doing good in society, of making a difference, of making life better, was to enter the ministry. As other careers, such as social work and different aspects of law, began to grow in both in popularity and in strength, young people had different choices that they could make, and many of them opted not to enter ministry as a career. During the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the United Church, through its General Council, developed positions on many different issues confronting church members in the wider society. Some of the most controversial of these had to do with changing understandings of fundamental human roles and relationships. One might well ask, and many at the time did, why would the church want to involve itself in such issues? After all, the church is about religion, and religion is about individual salvation and individual morality. For the most part, the authors of such reports and the general councils that commissioned them rejected any notion of a division between church and society. In social gospel terms, we might say that they've held that the light of the gospel ought to be shone on widely shared social concerns, family and personal relationships as much as political and economic institutions. And at the time, the authors of those reports showed no real concern that a Christian response might not be acceptable to all Canadians. It harkens back to the continuing notion of the United Church as being the conscience of the nation, as not recognizing that our Christian commitments might make it unacceptable for us to speak for all Canadians. There was still something of a disconnect in understanding the Church's real influence in society. Now, some of those reports we have already touched on when we addressed the changing roles of women and men. For instance, there were commissions on the ordination and on the gainful employment of women. And as we saw, these reports were often cast against a backdrop of slowly evolving societal roles and expectations. Not surprisingly, when the church wrote about such things, it created a variety of responses. But at least they weren't meddling in politics. So when we turn our focus to the issues of relationships and sexuality, it was often the social issues of the day that presented the motivating focus for task groups and reports. And that's very important to recognize that the various commissions and task groups did not go looking for controversial subjects, but they were responding to very real issues that were emerging in the society to which the United Church sought to be in ministry. So, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, divorce and remarriage were topics of considerable concern throughout Canadian society, as rates of divorce were climbing steadily. In a 1960 statement, the General Council declared that marriage is an intimate personal union to which a man and woman consent, perfected in a lifelong partnership of mutual love. Marriage is also a social institution, recognized and regulated by laws and customs that society develops. Then in 1962, a further statement by the General Council acknowledged that some marriages do fail and that divorced persons should not be excluded from the happiness of a new relationship. In other words, it was permissible for United Church clergy to officiate at the weddings of the previously divorced within a church sanctuary. That was a highly emotional and highly controversial decision for many in the church. Now, the authority of the session to rule on such weddings was clearly stated, as was the fact that no United Church minister could be compelled against their conscience to officiate. The General Council also urged the federal government to review the ways in which the divorced were treated in the laws of the nation and to establish a division of marriage and family welfare within the federal Department of Health and Welfare. In the 1970s, the General Council felt compelled to make yet further observations regarding divorce and remarriage, in part as a response to the still accelerating rates of divorce. The Council affirmed the necessity for Christian marriage to be lifelong in its intention, and it directed that any service of Christian marriage ought to include a vow expressing such a lifelong purpose. Later that decade, the General Council reaffirmed that final decisions regarding all matters related to the conduct of weddings rests with the minister and the local church in their oversight of worship. In the 1980s, there were several studies on human sexuality. And while some people never got over the shock of the idea of the church addressing sexuality in fairly forthright terms, the several reports argued that there were numerous issues that society and the church needed to address. The first of these reports, In God's Image, Male and Female, insisted that church and society needed to address wider and more factual education in human sexuality beginning at earlier ages, changes in societal understandings of sexual expression, the relationship of society and homosexual persons, sexual orientation and its impact on civil rights, and for the church, the ordination and commissioning of self-declared homosexual persons. The next step came in a document entitled Gift, Dilemma, and Promise in 1984, which made starkly clear several points that had only been hinted at in previous statements. All people are made in God's image, regardless of sexual orientation. In Gift, Dilemma, and Promise, marriage is referred to as a gift from God in which persons covenant with one another in the promise of lifelong companionship, expression of human affection, sexuality, and the nurture of children. It also affirmed the value of marriage as an institution and pledged the Church to work to redeem, care for, and strengthen the institution. Further, it acknowledged that marriage in name only is not part of God's plan, and that some marriages can be oppressive and destructive. In 1985, the General Council approved an educational resource for leaders preparing couples for marriage that asserted marriage as one of God's gifts and God's intention for many lives, but not all. And that's in a document entitled Living Together in Marriage. To set the stage for the next class, I just need to do a little bit of a preview. In 1988, the General Council reaffirmed previous declarations around human sexuality. So nothing that the General Council in 1988 said about human sexuality was new. What the General Council did make explicit was the conviction that all people, regardless of orientation, who profess faith in Jesus Christ are welcome to be members of the United Church. That was necessary because there was still some controversy about the moral and spiritual and salvific state of those who were homosexual in their orientation. As a result of being members of the United Church of Canada, they, like anyone else who is a member of the United Church of Canada, could be considered for leadership roles. So it's important that we as historians understand the sequence of what is occurring here. First off, individuals who are self-declaring as homosexual persons, presenting themselves to the various committees and bodies of the church, sensing a call from God to ministry. The committees and bodies of the church, while recognizing that there was in the manual no bar for such folks to become ordained or commissioned ministers, also recognized the strength of some of the social conventions and some of the unspoken biases within the church, and so raised up the matter with the appropriate courts of the church, moving through the presbytery and the conference to the General Council. The issue was never specifically about a person's sexual orientation and ministry. The issue was always about sexual orientation and membership. And once you had become a member, it was clear that any member of the United Church is eligible to be considered to be a minister. Given the social and religious context of the day, it was necessary to make that kind of assertion so that it was clear to all people. It also declares the conviction that God's intention is for all human relationships, is that they be faithful, responsible, loving, health giving, healing, and sustaining of the community and self. Now, for many people, those decisions in 1988 seemed to drop out of the sky, but of course they didn't. The United Church, as we've seen, has been engaged in its involvement and its concern and its expression of opinion about family life and those important institutions of society, such as marriage, right back to the days of the social gospel and the women's Christian temperance movement, when the prevalence of alcoholism was seen to be a negative impact on families. The quality of relationships, the significance of human interaction, the impact of those interactions on the wider society has always been something of which the United Church has had some input and some concern. And so when it became apparent that there was a particular group within the society who were being singled out for a particular form of mistreatment and being excluded from leadership in the church began to respond. Late, perhaps. Perhaps overly impacted by the values and standards of society. For sure. But that's the pattern that we've seen, isn't it? We are often caught up in the ways in which our society looks at the world until we realize that there's a gospel call to live differently. And so it is in this period of time as the church begins to wane in its social prominence, it begins to expand its levels of radical inclusion. At least they were seen to be radical in those days. And support for the realization of the full humanity of all people, minorities, majorities, in Canada or around the world, seeking to build the just community to which Christ calls us.